3 years ago, after I walked out of my last counseling session, that after being in it for almost 2 years, there's something I've never talked about here before. And it's not because I'm ashamed of it, and it's certainly not because I'm trying to tell anybody that they should or shouldn't go to counseling. That's never been what this channel is about. I simply tell my real stories and what I learned from them because I believe honest stories have a way of helping people find their own truth. And this is a big one for me. I started counseling because I knew something had happened to me during my marriage that I couldn't explain, just couldn't put words to it. Today, I know it was narcissistic abuse. But if you think that's where this story ends, you'd be very wrong. Because that was only a sliver of the truth that this journey eventually brought me to. Back then, I didn't even know what the word narcissism meant. I'd never watched a YouTube video about it. I'd never read a book about it. And I wasn't trying to diagnose anybody. I just knew something wasn't right. And I knew I wasn't me anymore. I knew I was angry. I knew I was hurt. And I knew I was completely lost. So I went to counseling. And if you'd have asked me, after almost 2 years, whether it helped me or not, I'd have looked you right straight in the eye and said, not really. And I would have meant that. But because I went into counseling with a completely different idea of what I thought was supposed to happen. I thought I was paying a professional to instantly make sense of it all. I figured if anybody has the answers, they will. But they didn't. Because they couldn't. Only I could. I just didn't understand that yet. I wanted someone to explain why she did what she did. I wanted someone to tell me, why I stayed or make sense of that. I wanted, someone to explain why I was so angry, why I was so hurt, and why I felt completely lost. I wanted answers. But instead, almost every session would eventually come back to some version of the same question. And that was always, Ron, how do you feel about that? And every single time I heard that inside my own head, I'd think, well, I'm angry, I'm hurt, I'm lost. And honestly, what kind of stupid ass question is that? I'm serious. That's exactly what I was thinking. Because I already knew how I felt. Or at least I thought I did. But what I didn't understand was why she kept asking me. I thought she was supposed to be giving me answers. But looking back 3 years later, I finally understand that her job was never to hand me the answers. Her job was to open the door to those answers. You know, Mine was to have the courage to walk through it with honesty. And that last part matters. Because once I finally started walking through that door honestly, I discovered something I never expected. This wasn't only about my marriage, not even close. There were things inside of me, from my childhood, my whole life, you know, things from business, things from relationships, decisions I'd made, things, people had done to me, things I'd done to myself, successes, failures, all of it, a whole life. But things I'd carried around for years without ever stopping long enough to ask myself what they even meant. It was all part of the whole picture of my life. And none of that was what I went into counseling looking for. I went there because my marriage had fallen apart. And I had no idea that I was about to start understanding, you know, the man who had lived an entire life that came before it. And strangely enough, one of the things that eventually opened that door wasn't some brilliant answer that my counselor gave me. It was something incredibly simple, you know, that she suggested that I start doing. She suggested that I start keeping a journal. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I heard that and thought that's a great idea. I didn't. That's not the kind of guy I am. I'm to just sit down and start writing stuff. But I was desperate. My life didn't make sense to me at all anymore. And if somebody I was paying to help me figure it out suggested I start writing things down, fine, I'll try it. So I did. You know, at first I didn't really know what the hell I was supposed to even write. You know, there wasn't some plan. There wasn't a list of questions I was trying to answer. I'd just sit down and write. Some of it was about my marriage, you know, obviously. You know, that's why I was in counseling in the first place. You know, but I'd write things that happened, things that had been said, things I couldn't understand. You know, I'd write about being angry, about being hurt, about being lost. But something started happening that I didn't expect. You know, I'd sit down thinking I was going to write about one thing, and 20 minutes later, I'd be somewhere completely different. You know, I'd be writing about something from childhood or something that happened earlier in my business or an odd old relationship, a friendship, you know, a decision I'd made. Something, you know, somebody had said to me years ago that apparently I'd never even, that I'd never forgotten. Sometimes it had absolutely nothing directly to do with my marriage. At least that's what I thought. You know, none of this was planned. I wasn't sitting down saying, okay, today we're going to dig into my childhood. Hell no. It just started coming out. And some of the things that came out just surprised the hell out of me. I mean, wow. You know, I'd write something, stop, look at it, and think, where did that come from? And that's when those stupid questions from counseling started making a little more sense. How do you feel about that? Well, apparently, I'm angry wasn't always the answer. Sometimes anger was just the easiest answer. You know, underneath that might have been fear or disappointment or regret or something that had happened 20 years earlier that I didn't even realize I was still carrying. And the more honestly I wrote, the more I started seeing pieces of myself that I'd never really looked at before. You know, not because somebody told me, you know, what they were, but because they were coming out of me. They were out of my own, right from my own pen, in my words, in my handwriting. And sometimes I would go back and read something that I'd written days or weeks earlier and see it completely differently. And I think I didn't even realize that's what I was saying. You know, that's when the journal stopped being a place where I was just writing down what happened to me. It became a place where I was starting to understand what happened inside of me. You know, and that's a huge difference between those two things. Because you know, I had spent most of my life doing what I think a lot of people do. Something happens, you deal with it. Something else happens, you deal with that. You know, you have a family, you work, you have responsibilities, you have bills, you have problems. You keep moving and you tell yourself, I'll deal with this later. You know, the problem is later turns into years. And eventually, you can have so much shit packed away inside of you that you don't even remember putting it there. That's what I started discovering. I thought I had started journaling because my marriage had fallen apart, but the journal didn't give a damn what I thought I was there to write about. Everything started coming out, you know, my childhood, my marriages, my business, friendships, mistakes, things I was proud of, things I definitely wasn't proud of, and things other people had done, but also things that I had done. And that last one is important because if you're really going to do this honestly, you don't get to make yourself the hero of every story. You know, there were things that I had to look at and say, yeah, that one was on me. There were decisions I made that weren't somebody else's fault. There were things I could have handled differently. There were patterns in my own life that I couldn't blame anybody for. And there were other things I finally realized I'd been carrying that never belonged to me in the first place. That's what I mean when I say you have to walk through that door with honesty. Because if I'd only written down everything, everybody else had ever done wrong to me, I don't think I would have learned a damn thing. I had to be willing to look at the whole picture. And slowly, that's exactly what started happening. I started seeing my life as a whole, just as a whole, instead of a collection of unrelated things that had happened to me. And here's the strange part. While all of this is happening, I still didn't think counseling was doing very much. I still thought I was the one doing all this work, and technically I was. But what I couldn't see yet was that the counselor had helped me open a door I didn't even know existed. And once that door was open, I never really stopped walking through it. Because 3 years later, I'm still writing in those journals. I still, journal almost every single day. And I don't do it because my life is falling apart anymore. I do it because I've learned, what happens when I don't keep everything locked up inside my own head. Sometimes I write a lot, sometimes I don't. And sometimes what comes out still surprises me. Remember what I said at the beginning? If you'd asked me when counseling ended whether those 2 years had helped me, I'd have said not really. Ask me today, though. My answer is completely different because I was measuring counseling by something it was never supposed to give me. I thought success meant somebody would finally explain my own life to me. That never happened because it couldn't. Nobody else could give me my truth. I had to find it. What my counselor could do was ask questions and listen, sometimes challenge me, give me language for things I didn't understand, and help me recognize patterns, that I couldn't even see. But most importantly, give me a place where I finally started saying things out loud instead of keeping everything buried inside. Then she suggested another tool, that journal. And without realizing it, I took those conversations home with me. That's what I couldn't see back then. Counseling didn't give me the answers. It taught me how to start looking for them. And here's something that I've never really told you. A lot of the videos that you watch on this channel start in that journal. Some of the things I talk about, you know, here are things I first wrote down sitting by myself. Thoughts about my childhood, relationships, business, mistakes I've made, things I've learned, things I didn't understand when they happened, but finally started making sense of them years later. That's where a lot of these videos come from. So in a strange way, when I sit here and tell you one of these stories, you're seeing part of a process that started years before this channel ever existed. I still journal almost every single day. And I know some of you are going to ask which one I use, so I'll put a link in the description to the journal I personally use every day. This is not a sales ad. But there's nothing magical about that particular journal. It's simply the one I use. What mattered to me is what I've been willing to put inside of it. But counseling couldn't rebuild my life either. My counselor couldn't make me get back out into the world. She couldn't make me learn how to enjoy my own company. She couldn't make me choose peace. She couldn't make me take chances again. And she damn sure couldn't make me start a YouTube channel at 55 years old. Those choices were mine. And I had to make every one of them myself. So no, I don't look back and say counseling fixed me. It didn't. It helped me start understanding the person who was going to have to do the fixing. Me. And maybe that's why, I'm finally talking about this 3 years later. Not to tell you to go to counseling, not to tell you not to, just to tell you, what I got wrong. I spent almost 2 years waiting for a professional to give me an answer, or my answers, and she couldn't. Only I could find those. Her job was to open the door. Mine was to have the courage to walk through it with honesty. And, to be honest, I'm still walking through that door today. Y'all, I just thought I would share that with you, and I'll see you in the next one.